Imagine standing on a beach 50,000 years ago. The sun is setting over an endless ocean. Waves crash against the shore, stretching to the horizon in every direction. You have no map, no compass, no metal tools, no written language. You've never seen a boat bigger than a simple raft used to cross rivers, and yet, somehow, you're about to do something that seems absolutely impossible. You're going to cross an ocean to land you can't see, don't know exists, and have no proof is even there. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's literally why I make these. So subscribe maybe, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I check comments, and it's fascinating. Tokyo at sunrise, London at midnight, Sao Paulo during lunch break, all experiencing the same ancient mystery at once. Today, we take ocean travel for granted. You can fly from New York to Sydney in less than a day. Container ships the size of cities cross the Pacific carrying millions of tons of cargo. We have satellites, GPS, weather forecasts, emergency beacons. The ocean is still dangerous, but it's mapped, understood, conquered. But 50,000 years ago, the ocean was the edge of the world, the ultimate barrier, the place where the known ended and the impossible began. And yet humans crossed it, not once, not twice, dozens of times, in boats that shouldn't have worked, to places they shouldn't have known existed, across distances that should have killed them. Here's what keeps archaeologists up at night. Around 65,000 years ago, humans were living in Africa and parts of Asia. Stone Age people, hunter-gatherers. Their most advanced technology was shaped rocks and controlled fire. Then suddenly, impossibly, these same people appear in Australia. Not the Australia you can drive to. Not the Australia connected by land bridges. The Australia that was separated from the nearest Asian landmass by at least 50 miles of open ocean. And not calm ocean. We're talking about some of the most treacherous waters on Earth. Strong currents, unpredictable weather. Waters filled with sharks and saltwater crocodiles. There's no gradual build-up in the archaeological record. No evidence of failed attempts. No remains of primitive boats that didn't quite make it. Just suddenly, definitively, humans on the other side of an ocean barrier that should have been uncrossable. The math doesn't work, the technology doesn't work, the navigation doesn't work, and yet it happened. We know it happened because we found them. Human remains, stone tools, rock art, fire pits, all dated to at least 65,000 years ago. Some researchers now think it might be even earlier, maybe 80,000 years ago, which makes it even more impossible. See, this isn't like early humans migrating across land. That makes sense. You follow rivers, you track animal herds, you can see where you're going. If things get bad, you turn around. But ocean crossing? That's different. That requires planning, boat building, provisions, navigation skills. Most terrifyingly, it requires faith. Faith that land exists somewhere out there beyond the horizon. Faith that your boat won't fall apart. Faith that you can find your way back if you need to, or better yet, find your way forward to something you've never seen. And Australia wasn't even the only crossing. Humans somehow made it to islands across the Pacific, the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, places separated by hundreds of miles of open water. Stone Age people remember no bronze, no iron, no wheels, no written records of how they did it. The really crazy part? We almost didn't discover this at all. For decades, archaeologists assumed early humans couldn't have crossed major water barriers. It was considered impossible. The textbook said humans only spread across land masses, following coastlines and river valleys. Ocean crossings were supposed to have happened much later, maybe 10,000 years ago when humans had developed more sophisticated boats. Then in the 1960s and 70s, archaeologists started finding evidence that didn't fit the timeline. Human sites in Australia that were way too old. Stone tools on islands that were never connected to mainlands. Rock art in places humans supposedly couldn't reach. At first, the dates were questioned. The methodologies were challenged. Because if the evidence was real, it meant rewriting everything we thought we knew about human capabilities. But the evidence kept mounting. Better dating techniques, more archaeological sites, genetic analysis. All of it pointing to the same impossible conclusion. Our Stone Age ancestors were crossing oceans tens of thousands of years before we thought they could. This isn't just about boats and navigation. This is about human cognition, about imagination, about the moment our ancestors looked at an endless horizon and thought, what if? What if there's something out there? What if we could reach it? What if we're capable of more than anyone thinks possible? Tonight, we're going to explore the impossible journeys nobody explains, how they did it, where they went, and why these ancient ocean crossings might be the most underrated achievement in human history. But here's where the story of human migration takes its most audacious turn, because around 65,000 years ago, a small group of modern humans did something that seems absolutely impossible, something that would change our understanding of what our ancestors were capable of. They crossed 90 kilometers of open ocean to reach a land they couldn't see, a land they had no way of knowing even existed. Let me be clear about what this means. 90 kilometers, that's 56 miles of open water. Stand on the beach in Southeast Asia and look toward Australia. You see nothing. The curvature of the Earth means the horizon is only about 5 kilometers away. Beyond that, just ocean. Empty, featureless ocean stretching to infinity. There are no mountains visible in the distance, no smoke signals, no birds flying back, and forth to indicate land beyond the horizon. Just water. And yet, they went. They built watercraft sophisticated enough to carry multiple people, provisions and tools across waters that could kill them in minutes if something went wrong. They navigated without compasses, without maps, without any of the technology we consider essential for ocean travel. And they made it. We know they made it because we found what they left behind. The evidence sits in a rock shelter in northern Australia called Majidbebe. It's not much to look at from the outside. Just another sandstone overhang in the rugged landscape of Arnhem Land. But when archaeologists began excavating there, they found something extraordinary. Stone tools, grinding stones, edge-ground axes, and pieces of ochre used for pigment, all buried in sediment layers that radiocarbon dating placed at 65,000 years old, maybe even older. Some estimates push it back to 70,000 years. This wasn't a temporary camp. This was a sustained human presence. People who'd crossed impossible waters, established themselves in a completely new land, and survived there long enough to leave behind clear evidence of their occupation. But here's what makes this even more remarkable. At 65,000 years ago, sea levels were much lower than today. During the Ice Age, so much water was locked up in glaciers that oceans worldwide dropped by 120 meters. Land masses that now separate were connected by land bridges. In Southeast Asia, this created a massive subcontinent called Sundaland. Modern-day Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, parts of Vietnam, all connected as one enormous landmass. You could walk from Singapore to Bali without getting your feet wet. Our ancestors spread across Sundaland easily, following game, exploiting resources, gradually moving south and east. But Sundaland had an edge, a coastline beyond which lay nothing but ocean. and beyond that ocean, separated by a minimum of 90 kilometres of open water, lay another landmass, Sahul, the combined continent of Australia and New Guinea, also connected by land bridges during low sea level periods. Between Sundaland and Sahul lay a series of deep ocean channels that never closed, even during the lowest sea levels of the Ice Age. The Lombok Strait, the Makassar Strait, stretches of water kept deep by the volcanic and tectonic activity that makes Indonesia one of the most geologically active regions on Earth. These channels were barriers, absolute, impassable barriers for every terrestrial animal that had ever tried to cross them. Australia's fauna evolved in complete isolation for millions of years. Giant marsupials, bizarre mammals, creatures found nowhere else on Earth. No large placental mammals ever made it across. No big cats, no elephants, no monkeys. The water was too deep, too wide, too dangerous. Except humans crossed it. Not once, but probably multiple times. The genetic evidence suggests that the initial colonization of Sahul involved multiple groups, possibly arriving in several waves over thousands of years. But that first crossing, the one that established the initial human population in Australia, that happened at least 65,000 years ago. And it required technology that shouldn't have existed. Think about what building an ocean-going vessel means. First, you need to understand that such a thing is even possible. You need the cognitive capacity to imagine travelling across water you can't see the end of. This isn't like crossing a river where you can see the other bank. This is heading out into the unknown with the faith that somehow, somewhere beyond the horizon, there is land. Then you need the technical knowledge to build something that will float reliably for hours, possibly days. It needs to carry multiple people because you can't establish a breeding population with just one or two individuals. It needs to carry fresh water because you can't drink seawater. It needs to carry tools and provisions because you don't know what you'll find on the other side. The boats themselves left no trace. Wood, bamboo, reeds, whatever they used rotted away tens of thousands of years ago. We have no direct evidence of what these vessels looked like, but we can make educated guesses based on materials available in Southeast Asia and traditional watercraft used by indigenous peoples in later periods. Bamboo is the most likely candidate. Southeast Asia has dozens of bamboo species, many of which grow fast, straight, and incredibly strong. Bamboo's natural hollow structure makes it naturally buoyant. Lash enough bamboo poles together, and you've got a raft that will float even when loaded with people and cargo. Traditional Southeast Asian and Pacific Island cultures built sophisticated bamboo rafts well into the modern era. Some could carry dozens of people. The design is elegant. Long bamboo poles form the base, lashed together with plant fibre cordage or rattan. Smaller crosspieces provide structural integrity. A simple bamboo mast can support a woven palm leaf sail to catch favourable winds. It's not fancy, but it works, and it's buildable with Stone Age technology. Reed boats are another possibility. Various Russian reed species grow in Southeast Asian wetlands. Ancient peoples across the world, from Egypt to South America, built sophisticated boats from bundled reeds. These vessels are surprisingly seaworthy. Thor Heyerdahl famously sailed a reed boat from Morocco to Barbados in 1970 to prove ancient Atlantic crossings were possible. His boat, the Orar-2, covered 6,100 kilometres of open ocean. So, we know reed technology can handle serious voyages. But here's what really matters. Building any watercraft sophisticated enough to cross 90 kilometres of open ocean requires abstract thinking at a level that transforms our understanding of human cognitive evolution. You have to plan for contingencies you've never experienced. You have to understand concepts like buoyancy, stability, and load, distribution without any formal training in physics. You have to grasp navigation, understanding that ocean currents and winds will push you off course, that you need to compensate, that the direction you point isn't necessarily the direction you'll travel. Most importantly, you have to believe in the unseen. You have to be capable of faith, if you want to call it that. The faith that there is something beyond the horizon worth risking everything to reach. This is theory of mind operating at an unprecedented level, the ability to imagine possibilities that have never been observed, to conceive of lands that might exist based on indirect evidence or pure speculation. Some researchers have suggested the first crossings might have been accidental. Maybe fishermen were blown off course by storms and happened to reach Australia by chance. Maybe groups floating on natural debris after tsunamis or floods accidentally drifted to Sahul and survived. But the evidence doesn't support this. Accidental drift voyages are almost always fatal. Ocean currents in the Indonesian region are complex and treacherous. Without active navigation, drifting vessels almost always get pushed back to the islands they started from or out into the open Pacific, where occupants die of thirst and exposure. More tellingly, the archaeological evidence from Majid Bebe shows that the people who arrived came prepared. They brought sophisticated tools, edge-ground axes, which require hours of patient grinding to manufacture, grinding stones for processing plant foods, ochre for pigment, suggesting they maintained cultural practices during the journey. These weren't desperate refugees who washed up barely alive. These were intentional colonists who knew they were going somewhere and brought what they'd need to survive. The timing of the crossing also argues against accident. 65,000 years ago represents a period when sea levels were dropping but hadn't reached their lowest point yet. The water crossing was actually longer than it would have been 10 or 20,000 years later. If these were accidental crossings, you'd expect them to happen during the easiest crossing conditions, when sea levels were lowest and islands were most closely spaced. But humans reached Australia during a relatively difficult period. This suggests they were capable enough that they didn't need to wait for optimal conditions. They went when they were ready. The navigation required for this crossing is also far more sophisticated than it first appears. The Indonesian archipelago creates complex current patterns. The Indonesian through flow, a powerful ocean current moving from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean, runs through these channels at speeds that can exceed 4 knots. Try to cross directly and the current will sweep you far off course. You have to angle your approach, compensate for drift, understand how wind and current interact. This is advanced seamanship, knowledge that takes years to acquire through observation and experience. So how did they learn these skills? There's only one possible answer. They practiced. For generations before anyone attempted the crossing to Sahul, human populations living on the Sundaland coast must have been developing maritime traditions. Fishing in coastal waters, exploring nearby islands that were visible from shore, building progressively more sophisticated watercraft, learning to read currents and winds and weather patterns. This wasn't a sudden leap. This was the culmination of hundreds or thousands of years of incremental technological and cognitive development. By the time someone decided to cross to the invisible land beyond the horizon, their people had already been seafarers for generations. They knew how to build boats that wouldn't sink. They understood navigation well enough to reach islands they could see. The crossing to Sahul was audacious, but it wasn't insane. It was the logical next step for a culture that had mastered coastal seafaring and was ready to push further. But why did they go? What drives people to risk everything crossing to lands they can't see? Resources might be part of the answer. Sundaland was filling up. 65,000 years ago, modern human populations were expanding rapidly across Southeast Asia. Competition for prime coastal territories was probably increasing. The best fishing spots, the most productive estuaries, were already claimed. Young people looking to establish their own groups might have been motivated to find new territories. There's also evidence that Sundaland populations might have had some indication that land existed beyond the horizon. Birds are the most likely clue. Many seabird species nest on land but feed far offshore. If you're fishing in coastal waters and you repeatedly see birds flying from a consistent direction every evening, you might reasonably conclude there's land in that direction. Follow the birds and you might find it. Some researchers have also suggested that during very clear weather conditions, mountains in northern Australia might occasionally be visible from high points in Indonesia. This is controversial, and the mathematics of curvature and atmospheric refraction make it uncertain. But if there were even occasional sightings, they would have provided concrete evidence that land existed beyond the visible horizon. But maybe the real answer is simpler and more profound. They went because they could. Because once humans developed the cognitive capacity for abstract thinking, for imagining possibilities beyond immediate experience, we became driven to explore, to see what's beyond the next ridge, what's across the river, what's beyond the horizon. This drive, this restless curiosity that makes humans fundamentally dissatisfied with staying in one place. It's not a bug, it's a feature, one that was selected for during those desperate bottleneck years when staying put meant death, and moving to new territories meant survival. The people who crossed to Sahel 65,000 years ago were carrying genes that had been refined through nearly 1 million years of selection for adaptability and exploratory behavior. They were the descendants of survivors who had made it through the worst climate crisis in human history, precisely because they were willing to move, to try new strategies, to risk the unknown rather than die in the known. Crossing 90 kilometers of open ocean to reach an invisible land was just the latest expression of that ancient survival strategy. And it worked. The archaeological record from Australia shows continuous human occupation from 65,000 years ago to the present. That initial founding population not only survived, they thrived. Within a few thousand years, their descendants had spread across the entire Australian continent, adapting to every environment from tropical rainforests to the driest deserts on Earth. They had accomplished something no other animal had ever done. They had crossed an uncrossable barrier and established themselves in a completely new world. But this was just the beginning. Because the technology and cognitive capacity required to reach Australia, that same toolkit would eventually carry humans to every habitable place on Earth. The first ocean crossers had proven that water wasn't a barrier anymore. It was a highway. Now, here's where most history books give up. They tell you humans crossed to Australia 65,000 years ago, then they just move on like that explains anything. But it doesn't explain anything. It just raises 1,000 more questions. The most important one being, how? How did Stone Age humans, people who supposedly barely had fire figured out, build vessels capable of crossing 60 miles of open ocean? How did they navigate without compasses, without maps, without any of the technology we assume is necessary for seafaring? How did they survive days or weeks at sea, without metal containers for fresh water, without preserved foods, without any of the equipment that modern sailors consider essential? The honest answer is, we don't actually know. They didn't leave instruction manuals. Bamboo and reeds don't fossilize. The vessels themselves disappeared thousands of years ago, rotted away in tropical climates or destroyed by the very oceans they conquered. All we have is the fact that they did it. The archaeological evidence is undeniable. Humans reached Australia. Therefore humans built ocean-going vessels. Therefore humans possess sophisticated maritime technology at least 65,000 years ago. But for decades, archaeologists and historians essentially shrugged and said, well, they must have gotten lucky. Maybe they were fishing close to shore and got blown off course. Maybe they were clinging to driftwood after a tsunami. Maybe it was just a series of incredibly fortunate accidents. This is what happens when we systematically underestimate the intelligence and capability of our ancestors. We assume that because they didn't have writing, or metal tools, or formal education, they must have been fundamentally less intelligent than modern humans. We imagine them as primitive, barely capable of abstract thought, succeeding mostly through luck and instinct. But that's not just wrong, it's backwards. The humans who crossed to Australia had the same brain capacity as modern humans. Actually, slightly larger on average. They had tens of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge passed down through oral traditions. They had evolved for hundreds of thousands of years specifically for adaptability and problem solving. They were, in every meaningful way, just as smart as anyone alive today. Smarter in some ways, because their survival depended on skills and knowledge we've completely forgotten. So, let's stop underestimating them and start taking seriously what they accomplished. In the last few decades, experimental archaeologists have been trying to recreate ancient vessels using only materials and techniques available to Stone Age peoples. The results have been eye-opening. In 1998, a team led by archaeologist Robert Bednarek built a bamboo raft using stone tools and plant fibre cordage. They launched it off the coast of Indonesia and successfully sailed it 600 miles across open ocean to Australia. Not drifted, sailed. With intentional navigation and course correction, the raft performed better than anyone expected. It was stable in rough seas, remarkably buoyant, and fast enough to make steady progress against wind and current. But here's what's important. Bednarek's team had the advantage of modern knowledge. They knew their destination. They had weather forecasts. They carried emergency equipment, and it still took them months of preparation, multiple failed attempts, and considerable expertise to pull it off. The ancient mariners who first made this crossing didn't have any of those advantages, which means they must have had something else. Knowledge. Incredibly sophisticated knowledge about materials, construction, and navigation that we've only begun to understand. Start with the vessels themselves. For years, archaeologists assumed ancient seafarers must have used log rafts or dugout canoes. These are the simplest watercraft, technologies that appear in multiple cultures. Surely Stone Age peoples couldn't have built anything more sophisticated. Then anthropologists started paying attention to isolated communities in Southeast Asia and the Pacific who never fully abandoned traditional boat-building techniques. What they found was astonishing. These communities were building vessels of remarkable sophistication using only natural materials. Bamboo rafts weren't just logs tied together. They were engineered structures. Builders selected specific bamboo species for different parts of the vessel. Some varieties for buoyancy, others for flexibility, still others for structural strength. They understood that bamboo is naturally segmented into airtight chambers. Even if the outer surface is damaged, the internal chambers keep it afloat. A bamboo raft is essentially unsinkable, but they didn't just tie bamboo together randomly. Traditional builders used complex lashing patterns that distributed stress evenly across the structure. They angled certain bamboo poles to create hull shapes that moved efficiently through water. They built raised platforms to keep people and cargo dry. They created steering mechanisms using weighted boards that could be raised and lowered to control direction. This isn't primitive technology. This is sophisticated naval architecture developed through generations of experimentation and refinement. And here's the genius part. Bamboo and reeds actually work better for long ocean voyages than the wooden boats that replaced them. Wood is rigid. When a wooden boat hits a large wave, the hull flexes, planks separate. Eventually, in rough seas, wooden boats develop leaks. They require constant maintenance. Bamboo is flexible. A bamboo raft moves with the waves instead of fighting them. This structure can twist and bend without breaking apart. Reed boats have similar properties. Ancient peoples in Egypt, Peru, and Easter Island all independently developed reed boat technology. They understood that reeds, properly bundled and sealed with natural resins, create vessels that are lightweight, buoyant, and incredibly resilient. In 1970, explorer Thor Heyerdahl built a reed boat called Ra-2 using traditional techniques learned from Lake Titicaca boat builders in Bolivia. He sailed it from Morocco to Barbados, crossing the Atlantic Ocean in a boat made from marsh reeds. The vessel performed brilliantly. Modern naval architects who examined Heyerdahl's boat were shocked by its seaworthiness. The reed bundles absorbed water but didn't sink. The flexible construction handled Atlantic swells better than many rigid vessels. The design that academic experts had dismissed as primitive was actually highly advanced, optimized through millennia of real-world testing. So, the ancient mariners who first crossed to Australia absolutely had the technology to build reliable ocean-going vessels. But building a boat is only half the problem. You also have to know where you're going. How do you navigate across 60 miles of open ocean without instruments? Modern sailors have GPS, compasses, charts, radio communication, weather satellites. Ancient mariners had none of that. What they had was observation. Incredibly detailed, multi-generational observation of natural phenomena that we've mostly forgotten how to see. Start with the stars. Every human culture that has ever existed has observed the night sky. Hunter-gatherers in particular develop sophisticated astronomical knowledge because they spend every night outdoors. They learn which stars rise in which directions. They track the movements of constellations across seasons. They notice that certain stars always appear above certain directions. Ancient navigators used this knowledge to maintain course headings. If you know that a particular star constellation rises in the east, you can use it to orient yourself. If you know the angle of certain stars relative to the horizon at different latitudes, you can estimate how far north or south you've travelled. Polynesian navigators whose techniques were recorded before Western contact could determine their latitude to within a few miles just by observing star positions. And here's the thing. Polynesian navigation techniques didn't appear out of nowhere. They represent the culmination of knowledge that probably stretches back to the first seafarers. The same astronomical observations that guided Polynesian voyages across the Pacific were available to the first humans crossing from Indonesia to Australia. But stars are just the beginning. Ancient navigators learned to read the ocean itself. Wave patterns change when you approach land. Deep ocean swells move in long, regular patterns. Near shore, these swells interact with the seafloor, creating shorter, choppier waves. An experienced navigator can detect these changes long before land becomes visible. Different wave patterns indicate different types of coastlines. Rocky shores create one kind of wave reflection, sandy beaches create another. A narrow passage between islands creates distinctive turbulent patterns. Ancient navigators developed mental maps of these patterns, allowing them to identify locations by wave characteristics alone. They also watched the clouds. Clouds form differently over land than over open ocean. Heat rising from land surfaces creates vertical cloud development. Even from 30 or 40 miles away, you can see the distinctive anvil-shaped clouds that form over islands. Some clouds have characteristic colors. Clouds over shallow lagoons appear greenish from reflected light. Clouds over deep water are darker. Experienced navigators could spot land by reading cloud patterns long before the land itself was visible. Birds provided even more specific information. Most seabirds return to land every night. If you see certain species flying in a specific direction in late afternoon, you know land is in that direction. Different bird species have different ranging distances. Some stay within 20 miles of land, others venture 50 or 60 miles out. By knowing which species is which, ancient navigators could estimate their distance from shore based on which birds they observed. They also learned to recognize feeding behavior. When seabirds start diving for fish in specific patterns, it often indicates upwelling currents near islands or reefs. Follow the birds to their feeding grounds, and you'll find navigational landmarks. Even floating debris provided clues. Coconuts, palm fronds, and other plant material don't drift randomly. They move in predictable patterns based on currents and winds. An experienced navigator could look at floating vegetation and deduce which direction land lay, and roughly how far away it was. But navigation is only useful if you can survive the journey. How did ancient mariners store fresh water for multi-day ocean crossings? They didn't have metal containers or ceramic jugs. What they had was bamboo. Remember those airtight internal chambers? They make perfect water storage containers. Cut a section of bamboo between two nodes and you have a completely waterproof tube. Seal one end with resin or tree sap, and you have a container that can hold a gallon or more of fresh water. A 30-foot bamboo raft could easily carry dozens of these containers, enough water for 20 people to survive 2 weeks at sea. For longer voyages, they learned to collect rainwater. Traditional Polynesian voyagers built rain catchers, simple fabric or bark surfaces that channeled rainfall into containers. Even morning dew could be collected from sails and stored. Food storage was equally sophisticated. Ancient peoples understood drying and smoking as preservation techniques. Fish dried in the sun can last for months. Coconuts, probably the single most important survival food for Pacific mariners, naturally store themselves. A mature coconut contains both food and drinkable liquid. It's almost as if coconuts evolved specifically to support long sea voyages. Some anthropologists think they did. Coconuts spread across the Pacific thousands of years before humans arrived on many islands. How? Probably by drifting on ocean currents. But also, possibly, by being deliberately transported by ancient seafarers who recognized their value as survival food. Modern experiments have shown that a properly provisioned bamboo raft can support a crew of 15 to 20 people for 3 weeks of ocean travel using only materials available to Stone Age peoples. That's more than enough time to cross from Indonesia to Australia, to reach most Pacific islands, to make any of the voyages we know ancient mariners completed. But here's what really reveals the sophistication of ancient seafaring. These weren't solo ventures. Building an ocean-going vessel, Even a simple bamboo raft requires coordinated labor from multiple people over weeks or months. You need specialists, people who know which bamboo to select and when to harvest it, people who understand lashing techniques and hull design, people who can create strong cordage from plant fibers, people who know celestial navigation and weather prediction. This requires social organization at a level that we usually associate with settled agricultural societies. Planning meetings where expeditions were discussed and agreed upon. Division of labor where different specialists contributed their expertise. Leadership structures where decisions about timing, routes, and provisioning could be made and enforced. Resource allocation where communities agreed to dedicate substantial labor to building vessels that might never return. Most importantly, it requires knowledge transmission. Someone had to teach the younger generation all these complex skills: bamboo selection, lashing techniques, astronomical observation, wave reading. This knowledge couldn't be learned by casual observation. It required dedicated teaching, probably through some kind of apprenticeship system where experienced mariners trained the next generation. We have direct evidence for this kind of knowledge transmission in modern Polynesian cultures, where navigation was traditionally taught through years of intensive training. Master navigators took apprentices on multiple voyages, teaching them to recognize thousands of stars, hundreds of wave patterns, dozens of bird behaviors. The training often lasted a decade or more. This wasn't primitive guesswork. This was professional education as sophisticated as anything in the modern world. And again, these Polynesian techniques didn't appear out of nowhere. They represent the preservation of knowledge that probably stretches back to the very first humans who decided to venture beyond the horizon. The ones who first crossed to Australia 65,000 years ago had to develop the same skills. They had to create the same social structures for teaching and preserving maritime knowledge. Think about what this means. We're not talking about lucky accidents. We're not talking about people clinging to driftwood and hoping for the best. We're talking about intentional exploration, supported by sophisticated technology and accumulated knowledge. We're talking about Stone Age peoples who possessed genuine expertise, who understood materials science and hydrodynamics, who could read environmental cues we can no longer see, who organized their society specifically to support long-distance maritime exploration. And here's the really humbling part. We can barely recreate what they accomplished routinely. Modern experimental archaeologists, with all our knowledge and technology, struggle to build vessels that perform as well as ancient designs. We have trouble navigating using traditional techniques. We keep discovering that methods we dismissed as primitive actually represent incredibly sophisticated understanding of natural principles. We underestimated them. For centuries we underestimated them. We assumed that without writing, without formal institutions, without the technological infrastructure of civilization, humans couldn't possibly accomplish complex feats of engineering and navigation. But the archaeological evidence keeps proving us wrong. They crossed oceans, they colonized continents, they navigated thousands of miles of open water and found tiny island targets. They developed technologies that worked so well, some remained in use for 50,000 years. These weren't primitive savages getting lucky. These were human beings every bit as intelligent as anyone alive today, applying that intelligence to problems we can barely imagine. When you're planning a voyage to an island you've never seen, knowing that failure means everyone dies of dehydration in the middle of the ocean, you get really, really good at boat building and navigation really fast. Natural selection doesn't give second chances. The humans who successfully made these crossings were the ones who had mastered these technologies. The ones who hadn't, Well, their genetic lines ended 40 miles from shore. What survived was genius. What survived was tens of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about materials, navigation, survival, and social organization. What survived was human capability at its absolute peak, operating without any of the safety nets of civilization, no rescue services, no weather forecasts, no backup plans, just knowledge, skill, and the courage to sail beyond the horizon into an unknown that might contain new lands or might contain nothing but death. They did it anyway, and that's what we need to understand if we're going to make sense of what happened next. Now here's where the story gets really interesting, because when we talk about humans crossing oceans, we're missing something absolutely crucial. Something that changes everything we think we know about early seafaring. There was a continent, not metaphorically, not approximately, an actual continent that existed right where you'd need it for humans to spread from Asia to Australia and the Pacific Islands. And then it vanished. Completely, utterly, swallowed by rising seas so gradually that the people living there probably didn't even realize what was happening until it was too late. Geologists call it Sundaland. You've never heard of it because it hasn't existed for 8,000 years, but for hundreds of thousands of years, Sundaland was one of the most important landmasses on Earth. A vast continental shelf connecting what we now call Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand and Vietnam into a single enormous territory. Not scattered islands, not narrow land bridges, a genuine continent roughly the size of Western Europe, with river systems as long as the Danube, mountain ranges as impressive as the Alps, forests teeming with life. And it was home. For how many humans? We'll never know exactly, but population models suggest tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people living across Sundaland at its peak, building settlements, developing technologies, creating cultures that existed for millennia. All of it is gone now, completely underwater, buried under 40 to 120 meters of seawater, covered by sediment, erased from human memory so thoroughly that we only rediscovered its existence in the 1990s when marine geologists started mapping the Southeast Asian seafloor and realized they were looking at river valleys and coastlines. Here's what happened. Around 20,000 years ago, the world was locked in the last glacial maximum, the deepest freeze of the most recent ice age. So much water was trapped in ice sheets covering North America, Europe and Asia that global sea levels were 120 meters lower than today. That's a 40-story building worth of water just gone, locked up in glaciers, and when you drop sea levels by 120 meters in Southeast Asia, something remarkable happens. The continental shelf is shallow there, gently sloping. Drop the water level just 50 meters and islands start connecting. Drop it 120 and you create Sundaland. A vast tropical and subtropical continent stretching from modern Myanmar in the west to Borneo in the east, from southern China in the north to Java in the south. Over 1.8 million square kilometers of dry land where today there's only ocean. The climate would have been different from today. Drier in some areas because ocean moisture couldn't penetrate as far inland. Wetter in others because of the massive river systems draining the interior. The Western Pacific warm pool, that engine of global weather patterns, would have been pushed hundreds of kilometers east. But here's what matters for human migration. Sundaland wasn't just a corridor. It wasn't just a convenient land bridge that let early humans walk from Asia toward Australia. It was a destination, a place worth living. The archaeological evidence we do have from caves in the mountains that still poke above sea level today shows sophisticated human occupation. stone tools that rival anything being made in Africa or Europe at the same time, evidence of systematic hunting, fire use, possibly even early agriculture. People weren't just passing through Sundaland. They were thriving there, building permanent settlements along those now vanished rivers, developing maritime traditions by exploiting the rich coastal resources along Sundaland's extensive shorelines, creating trading networks that connected communities across hundreds of kilometres. And then the ice started melting, not all at once, not catastrophically, at least not at first. But starting around 19,000 years ago, global temperatures began rising. Slowly, generation by generation, the ice sheets that had locked up so much of Earth's water began their retreat. The first changes would have been subtle. Maybe the seasonal floods along the great Sundaland rivers got a bit higher each year. Coastal settlements that had been a comfortable distance from the sea found high tides reaching a bit closer. Islands that had been connected by land bridges became separated during the highest spring tides, then reconnected at low water, then separated permanently. For people living in the interior, life probably continued normally for thousands of years, but for coastal populations the world was transforming. Archaeological modelling suggests sea levels rose unevenly, with periods of relative stability punctuated by episodes of rapid increase. There's evidence of meltwater pulses, periods lasting just a few centuries when sea level rise accelerated to rates that would have been noticeable within a single human lifetime. Imagine you're a child growing up on the southern coast of Sundaland around 14,000 years ago. The stories your grandparents tell about the coastline don't match what you see. They remember islands that are now just reefs visible at low tide. They remember river mouths that were a full day's walk inland, now swallowed by the encroaching sea. They remember sacred sites, burial grounds, places of power that are now underwater, and it keeps getting worse. Every generation the sea claims more territory. By 12,000 years ago, Sundaland is fragmenting. The low-lying central plains are becoming vast shallow seas. What had been a single continent is breaking apart into the islands we know today, Sumatra separating from Malaysia, Java becoming isolated, Borneo turning from a central highland into a massive island. The human impact would have been catastrophic. Millions of square kilometres of prime territory, land that had supported human populations for hundreds of thousands of years, vanishing beneath the waves over just a few thousand years. That sounds like a long time, but in terms of human adaptation, it's incredibly rapid. Where did all those people go? Some would have retreated to the highlands, following the rising waters upslope generation by generation. These would be the ancestors of modern Indonesians, Malaysians and Vietnamese, populations that still carry genetic markers suggesting ancient bottlenecks, periods when their ancestors were compressed into smaller territories and forced to adapt rapidly. But others had nowhere to go but out. And this is where the story of ocean crossing really begins, because the rising seas that destroyed Sundaland didn't just eliminate territory, they created something else, a whole new landscape of islands, channels, straits, and seas. A world where the old survival strategies didn't work anymore. You can't hunt megafauna that are now underwater. You can't gather plant resources from forests that have become coral reefs. You can't maintain trading relationships with communities that are now separated by kilometres of open ocean. But you can adapt. You can learn to build better boats. You can develop navigation techniques. You can figure out how to preserve food for long ocean voyages. You can become seafaring people because the alternative is extinction. This is what biologists call a bottleneck-driven adaptation event. environmental change so rapid and so severe that it creates overwhelming selection pressure for specific traits. In this case, maritime capabilities. Populations that already had some boat-building skills, maybe simple dugout canoes for river fishing, suddenly found those skills had become the difference between survival and death. The genetic evidence supports this scenario. Modern Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander populations show signatures of rapid population expansion starting around 10,000 years ago, exactly when you'd expect if refugees from flooding Sundaland were dispersing to new territories and adapting to island environments. More tellingly, linguistic analysis shows that many Southeast Asian and Pacific language families radiate from a common origin around this same period, as if populations that had once been connected by land were suddenly separated by water, their languages diverging as contact became more difficult, and the archaeological evidence, what little we have, tells the same story. The oldest sophisticated watercraft we've found in Southeast Asia date to around 12,000 years ago. Not simple dugouts, but complex boats capable of carrying multiple passengers and cargo across open water. The oldest clear evidence of systematic deep-sea fishing comes from the same period. But here's the frustrating thing. Most of the evidence is gone. Not just gone, but actively inaccessible. Because the settlements that would tell us the most about this transition, the coastal communities that were leading the adaptation to maritime life, are now 40 to 120 meters underwater, buried under millennia of sediment on the Southeast Asian continental shelf. Underwater archaeologists have been trying to access this lost history for decades, and slowly, incredibly, they're succeeding. In 2003, divers discovered worked stone tools on the seafloor between Australia and New Guinea, in areas that would have been dry land during the Ice Age. In 2015, researchers found evidence of what appears to be a submerged settlement off the coast of southern Thailand, including stone foundations and pottery in water 60 meters deep. The most remarkable discoveries have come from the South China Sea, where Chinese and international researchers are using advanced sonar mapping to identify drowned river valleys and ancient coastlines. They've found what look like linear structures, possible roads or canals, running for kilometers across the seafloor. They've identified geological features that appear to be modified by humans, platforms, terraces, possible harbour works. None of this is confirmed yet. Underwater archaeology is expensive, technically challenging, and complicated by the fact that everything is covered in sediment and marine growth. But the evidence keeps accumulating. And it all points to the same conclusion. Sundaland wasn't just inhabited, it was developed. People built sophisticated settlements there. They created infrastructure. They developed advanced maritime technologies, and when the floods came, when their world literally disappeared beneath the waves, they didn't just give up and die. They adapted. They took their boat-building skills, refined through generations of necessity, and they set out to find new homes. Some went north, back toward mainland Asia. Some went west toward India. Some went east, island hopping through what would become Indonesia and Melanesia, and some went south, making the open ocean crossing to Australia. Not in one dramatic voyage, but in waves of migration over thousands of years, each generation pushing a bit further, settling new islands, developing new technologies, learning new navigation techniques. The genetic record shows this dispersal clearly. Modern Australian Aboriginal populations carry genetic markers that trace back to Sundaland populations. So do Melanesians, Polynesians, even some groups in Madagascar off the coast of Africa. suggesting migrants from flooding Sundaland reached incredibly far distances. This wasn't random wandering. Genetic analysis shows the migration patterns were structured, deliberate. Populations weren't just drifting aimlessly, they were exploring systematically, probably following resources, bird migrations, ocean currents, whatever clues they could find that promised land beyond the horizon. And here's what makes this story so profound. The flooding of Sundaland created the first truly maritime human cultures. Before this, boats had been useful tools, convenient for crossing rivers or fishing in protected waters. After Sundaland, for the refugee populations dispersing from the drowned continent, boats became civilization. Your survival technology, your trading platform, your connection to other communities, your means of expansion into new territories. These populations developed what anthropologists call a maritime adaptation package. Not just boats, but everything that makes seafaring possible. Navigation by stars and currents, weather prediction, food preservation for long voyages, social structures that could maintain discipline during dangerous crossings, spiritual beliefs that made sense of a world dominated by the ocean. Most importantly, they developed knowledge systems for transmitting this information across generations. Stories, songs, chants, and rituals that encoded practical navigation information in memorable formats. The same kind of oral traditions that would eventually carry Polynesian navigators across the Pacific. All of this innovation, this entire revolution in human capabilities, was driven by environmental catastrophe. The drowning of Sundaland didn't destroy the human populations living there. It transformed them. It forced them to develop new survival strategies so sophisticated that their descendants would eventually colonize every island in the Pacific, cross the Indian Ocean to Madagascar, and possibly, though this remains controversial, even reach the Americas via Pacific routes thousands of years before Columbus. We are still discovering the extent of this lost world. Every year, marine archaeologists find new evidence of submerged settlements, drowned harbours, ancient coastlines now far beneath the waves. Every new discovery pushes back the timeline for sophisticated maritime technology. Every genetic study reveals new connections between modern populations and those ancient Sundaland refugees. But the essential story is becoming clear. Humans didn't cross the oceans despite the challenges. They crossed them because they had no choice. When the ice melted and the seas rose, when an entire continent vanished beneath the waves, the survivors didn't have the luxury of fear. They had to learn to sail or die. And so they learned. They built boats that could handle open ocean. They developed navigation systems that could guide them to lands they'd never seen. They created maritime cultures sophisticated enough to colonize the entire Pacific. All because 20,000 years ago, the world started warming, and the home of countless generations began its slow dissolution into the sea. But the story of ocean crossing was just beginning. Because while modern humans had successfully reached Australia 65,000 years ago, that journey had been across relatively short water gaps. Island hopping through Indonesian archipelagos with land always visible on the horizon. What happened next would make those early crossings look like practice runs. Around 3,500 years ago, a group of people living on the coast of Taiwan made a decision that would lead to the most ambitious maritime expansion in human history. They looked out at the Pacific Ocean, the largest body of water on Earth, covering 1/3 of the planet's surface, and they decided to colonize it. All of it. This wasn't a single voyage. It wasn't even a single generation's worth of exploration. It was a 5,000-year project of systematic expansion that would eventually settle islands separated by thousands of miles of open ocean. Islands so remote that some wouldn't be discovered again by Europeans until the 18th and 19th centuries. Islands that seemed impossible to reach with Stone Age technology. But here's what makes this story extraordinary. These weren't accidents. These weren't desperate refugees blown off course by storms, stumbling onto new lands by chance. These were intentional, planned colonization voyages. We know this because of what they brought with them. Not just people, but entire ecosystems. Pigs, chickens, dogs, taro, breadfruit, coconuts, banana plants, sugarcane. You don't accidentally bring a complete agricultural package when you're blown off course. You bring it when you're planning to stay. The expansion started from Taiwan around 1500 BCE. The first movers were the ancestors of the Lapita people, named after a distinctive style of pottery they created, decorated with intricate geometric patterns that would become the archaeological trail markers of their expansion. Within a few centuries they had moved through the Philippines and into the islands of Melanesia, eastern Indonesia, New Guinea, the Bismarcks. This phase was relatively straightforward, island hopping through archipelagos where the next island was usually visible from the last. But they were learning, developing technologies, refining navigation techniques, building the cultural knowledge base that would eventually let them cross distances that should have been impossible. The key technology was the canoe, but not just any canoe. The outrigger canoe, one of the most elegant engineering solutions in human history. Take a dugout canoe, hollowed from a single massive tree trunk. Now attach a floating outrigger arm extending from one side. This single addition transforms everything. Suddenly your canoe can't capsize. The outrigger prevents tipping and provides stability even in rough seas. You can add a sail because the wind won't flip you over. You can carry cargo, passengers, livestock, all while maintaining seaworthiness in ocean swells. But for the really long voyages they needed something even more sophisticated. The double-hulled voyaging canoe. 2 large hulls connected by a platform deck, sometimes 60 or 70 feet long. These vessels could carry 50 people along with all their supplies, animals and plants. They were fast, capable of sustained speeds of 6 to 8 knots. They could sail into the wind using sophisticated tacking techniques, and they were stable enough to survive storms that would sink any European vessel of comparable technology level. These weren't primitive rafts. They were ocean-going ships, representing thousands of years of cumulative engineering refinement. Every joint, every lashing, every design element has been tested and optimized through generations of trial and error. The Polynesians had developed what was arguably the most advanced maritime technology in the world at the time, all without metal tools, all using stone, bone and coral implements. But the technology was only half the equation. The real magic was navigation. Because here's the problem with the Pacific. Once you sail beyond the archipelagos, once you head into remote Oceania, the space between islands becomes enormous. It's 2,400 miles from Samoa to Hawaii, 2,300 miles from the Marquesas to Easter Island, 2,000 miles from Tahiti to New Zealand. And these aren't straight-line distances. Ocean currents push you off course. Winds shift. Storms blow you hundreds of miles from your intended path. How do you find a tiny island, sometimes just a few miles across, in the middle of millions of square miles of featureless ocean, with no GPS, no compass, no sextant, no written charts? The answer is, you learn to read the ocean itself. The Polynesian navigation system, which survived in fragmentary form until modern times, and has been partially reconstructed through indigenous knowledge holders and experimental archaeology, represents one of the most sophisticated mental technologies ever developed by pre-literate societies. They navigated by stars, but not the way you might think. They didn't use instruments to measure star positions. They memorized. A trained navigator would know hundreds of stars, their rising and setting points on the horizon for every time of year, the arcs they traced across the sky, the exact compass bearings they indicated at different times of night. They created what's called a star compass, a mental map of the night sky divided into 32 directional segments, each marked by the rising and setting points of specific stars. But stars are only visible at night and only when skies are clear, so they read ocean swells, not waves, which are surface disturbances caused by local winds, swells, the deep rhythmic rolling of the ocean generated by distant weather systems. Swells maintain consistent directions for hundreds of miles. A trained navigator could feel swells from 4 or 5 different directions simultaneously, recognizing each by its period, its rhythm, the way it rocked the canoe. By monitoring how these swells interacted, how they reflected off distant lands, they could maintain course even in complete darkness, even under clouded skies. They watched birds, not randomly, but systematically. Different seabird species have different foraging ranges. Some species never venture more than 20 miles from land. Others range 100 miles or more. A navigator who understood bird behavior could read their flight patterns at dawn and dusk to determine the direction and approximate distance to the nearest island. Frigate birds head into roost in the evening point straight toward land. Terns fishing offshore indicate you're entering an island's resource zone. They observed cloud formations. Islands, especially high volcanic islands, create distinctive cloud patterns visible from 50 or 60 miles away. Rising air over land causes clouds to build vertically. The color of clouds reflects the lagoons beneath them, greenish tints indicating shallow water and reef systems. At night, clouds above inhabited islands sometimes reflect the glow of fires. They even read the water itself. Color changes indicating depth variations, temperature shifts marking current boundaries, the presence of certain fish species indicating proximity to reefs, phosphorescence patterns in the water showing underwater topography, floating debris indicating wind and current directions. All of this information was synthesized simultaneously, continuously, by navigators who had spent decades learning the ocean's language. This knowledge was taught in specialized navigation schools on certain islands. Students would spend years memorizing charts containing thousands of pieces of navigational information, star bearings, island locations, current patterns, seasonal wind shifts, voyage strategies. The curriculum was so complex that only a small percentage of students successfully completed training, and we know it worked because they succeeded. Starting around 1000 BCE, Lapita descendants began pushing into remote Oceania. By 900 BCE, they had reached Samoa and Tonga, jumping almost 2,000 miles past the Solomon Islands to colonize the first truly remote Pacific islands. These became the homeland of Polynesian culture proper. For about 1,000 years they consolidated, populations grew, the distinctive Polynesian culture emerged, refining their languages, their technologies, their social systems. Then around 300 CE, the expansion resumed, this time heading into the vast eastern Pacific. First, they reached the Marquesas Islands, a cluster of volcanic peaks rising from the seafloor roughly in the middle of the Pacific. From there, they launched what can only be described as exploration on an almost incomprehensible scale. Around 400 CE, voyaging canoes from the Marquesas sailed northeast, navigating more than 2,000 miles of open ocean to discover and colonize Hawaii. Think about that for a moment. 2,000 miles. No land in between. If you miss Hawaii, which is a relatively small target in oceanic terms, you sail into empty ocean until you die. There's nothing beyond Hawaii until you reach Alaska, thousands of miles further. This wasn't an accident. They brought pigs, dogs, chickens, breadfruit, taro, banana plants. They brought everything needed to establish permanent settlements. They knew they would find land, and they did. Around the same year, other voyagers sailed southeast from the Marquesas, eventually reaching Easter Island, the most remote inhabited island in the world, only 300 miles from the nearest inhabited land, a tiny speck of volcanic rock in the middle of nowhere. Yet they found it, colonized it, built a complex society there, complete with the massive stone moai statues that would later baffle European explorers. And around 1200 CE, voyagers from central Polynesia sailed southwest to discover and colonize New Zealand, the last major landmass on Earth to be settled by humans. New Zealand presented completely different challenges than other Pacific islands. It was huge, with diverse climates ranging from subtropical to subantarctic. It had no native land mammals except bats, requiring major adaptations to Polynesian agricultural and hunting practices. The flora was utterly different from anything Polynesians had encountered before. Yet within a few centuries, the Maori, as the New Zealand Polynesians became known, had developed a thriving culture perfectly adapted to their new home. They had modified their tropical agricultural package to work in temperate climates. They had developed new hunting technologies to exploit the giant flightless moa birds that had never encountered human predators. They had created new artistic traditions, new social structures, new ways of organizing society appropriate to this strange new land. The scale of this expansion is difficult to comprehend. The Polynesian Triangle, bounded by Hawaii in the north, Easter Island in the east, and New Zealand in the southwest, covers an area larger than all the continental landmasses combined. Within this vast region, Polynesians had located and colonized every significant island, specks of land separated by thousands of miles of ocean, islands that European explorers with superior navigation technology would struggle to find centuries later. And here's what proves these were intentional voyages, not lucky accidents. They maintained contact. The archaeological and genetic evidence shows ongoing exchange between island groups for centuries after initial colonization. Hawaiian populations show genetic evidence of contact with Tahiti long after Hawaii's initial settlement. Easter Island populations maintained contact with South America, bringing back sweet potatoes, which subsequently spread throughout Polynesia. New Zealand Maori oral traditions record specific return voyages to central Polynesia and back. This means they weren't just sailing out into the unknown and hoping for the best. They were navigating there and back, voyaging 2,000 miles, finding a tiny island, staying for a period, then successfully navigating 2,000 miles home to report what they'd found, then organizing colonization expeditions and successfully retracing the route. This is navigation at a level that should have been impossible with Stone Age technology. For centuries, Western scholars didn't believe it. When European explorers first encountered Polynesians spread across the Pacific, they couldn't explain how Stone Age people had accomplished what seemed to require advanced navigation technology. Some proposed that Polynesians had been carried by ocean currents, passive riders on nature's highways. Others suggested they had been blown off course by storms, accidental colonists who stumbled onto new lands by chance. A few even proposed lost advanced civilizations or intervention by extraterrestrial visitors, unable to conceive that humans without writing or metal could achieve such navigational precision. But the Polynesians themselves never forgot. In a few places, particularly in the Caroline Islands of Micronesia, the ancient navigation tradition survived into the modern era. Traditional navigators called Palu still practiced the old techniques, sailing between islands using only traditional wayfinding methods. No instruments, no charts, nothing but their knowledge of stars, swells, birds and clouds. In 1976, a group of Hawaiian activists and anthropologists decided to prove what their ancestors had achieved. They built hokulea, a traditional double-hulled voyaging canoe, using ancient designs but modern materials. They recruited Mau Piailug, a traditional navigator from Satawal in Micronesia, to teach them the old techniques and guide their first voyage. Then they sailed from Hawaii to Tahiti, 2,400 miles, using only traditional navigation. No instruments, no GPS, no compass. Just Mau Piailug reading the ocean. It took 33 days. They arrived within a few miles of their target. After centuries of dismissal and doubt, they had proven the old ways worked. Since then, Hokulea has sailed over 150,000 miles, circumnavigated the Pacific, even circumnavigated the globe, all using traditional navigation techniques. New generations of Polynesian navigators have been trained. The knowledge that nearly died out has been preserved and is expanding again. And every voyage proves what should have been obvious all along. The Polynesians weren't lucky. They weren't primitive people stumbling onto new lands by accident. They were master navigators who developed sophisticated technologies and knowledge systems that allowed them to intentionally explore and colonize the largest ocean on Earth. They looked at an ocean that covered 1/3 of the planet and decided to cross it. Not once, but hundreds of times. Not by accident, but by design. They carried their entire world with them, pigs and chickens and plants and culture, establishing new societies on islands separated by distances that would terrify modern sailors. They maintained contact across thousands of miles of open ocean, creating exchange networks that spanned an area larger than all the continents combined. And they did it all with canoes and knowledge, with stars and swells, with courage and skill accumulated over thousands of years of continuous refinement. The Polynesian expansion represents one of humanity's greatest achievements, a systematic colonization of the impossible that proves what humans are capable of when they combine sophisticated technology with accumulated knowledge and sheer determination. They didn't conquer the Pacific by accident. They mastered it through centuries of learning, innovation, and the kind of courage that looks at an endless horizon and sees not a barrier but an invitation. But they weren't the only ones attempting the impossible. Because on the other side of the world, separated by 2 oceans and thousands of years, other seafarers might have been making crossings that official history claims never happened. But while the Pacific tells a story of deliberate, systematic ocean crossing, the Atlantic holds a different kind of mystery, one that's messier, more controversial, and deeply frustrating to archaeologists who demand clear proof. Because here's the uncomfortable truth that mainstream archaeology doesn't like talking about. There's evidence suggesting people crossed the Atlantic Ocean long before Columbus, long before the Vikings, maybe even during the Ice Age itself. The problem? Most of that evidence sits in a grey zone between absolutely impossible and we can't quite explain this away. Let me show you what I mean. Start with something that should be simple. In the 1970s and 80s, German toxicologist Svetlana Balabanova was testing ancient Egyptian mummies for evidence of diseases and environmental contaminants. Standard scientific procedure, nothing controversial. Then she found something that shouldn't exist. Cocaine and nicotine. Not trace amounts, not contamination. Significant quantities of both substances in multiple mummies, including the 3,000-year-old mummy of Henut Tawi, a priestess from the 21st dynasty. Now, cocaine comes from coca plants. Nicotine comes from tobacco. Both are New World plants. They don't exist naturally anywhere in Africa, Europe, or Asia. The only place ancient Egyptians could have gotten these substances was from the Americas, which means either someone was crossing the Atlantic 3,000 years ago, or something is very wrong with our understanding of botany, chemistry, or archaeology. Maybe all three. The reaction from mainstream archaeology was swift and brutal. Balabanova's findings were dismissed as contamination, fraud, or misidentification. Critics pointed out that modern handling could have introduced the substances, that maybe ancient Egyptians were using different plants that happened to produce similar chemical signatures, that the testing methods weren't reliable enough. Fair criticisms. Science demands skepticism. But here's where it gets interesting. Balabanova's findings have been replicated. Multiple independent labs testing different mummies have found the same substances. Not every mummy, but enough to suggest this wasn't just contamination or error. And nobody has identified any Old World plant that produces cocaine or nicotine in the quantities detected. The alternative explanations keep failing, but mainstream archaeology refuses to accept the obvious conclusion because it would require rewriting too much of what we think we know about ancient maritime capabilities. So let's look at something even more controversial, the Solutrean hypothesis. This is the idea that during the last ice age, specifically around 20,000 to 15,000 years ago, people from southwestern Europe crossed the Atlantic and contributed to the peopling of North America. The evidence? Tool technologies. The Solutrean culture of Ice Age Europe created distinctive stone tools, particularly projectile points with very specific flaking patterns. These tools appear in Europe around 22,000 years ago. Then, suddenly nearly identical tools show up in North America around 16,000 years ago, associated with what's called the Clovis culture. The similarities are remarkable. Not just general resemblance, but specific manufacturing techniques that seem too specialized to have evolved independently. Both cultures used overshot flaking, where the toolmaker strikes off a flake that travels across the entire width of the tool. This creates a very distinctive appearance and requires significant skill. Both cultures created laurel leaf points, long, thin, symmetrical projectile points that are more artistic than practical. The technological similarities are striking, but the problem is geography. You've got Solutrean sites in France and Spain. You've got Clovis sites spreading across North America. Between them is 3,000 miles of the North Atlantic Ocean. During the Ice Age, yes, sea levels were lower, but not that much lower. The Atlantic was still 300 feet deep or more along most potential crossing routes. So how could Ice Age Europeans have made this journey? The hypothesis suggests they followed the ice. During the maximum extent of glaciation, sea ice extended south from Greenland almost to the latitude of northern Spain. Not solid ice, but a broken field of icebergs and ice floes that changed with the seasons. The theory goes that Solutrean hunters, already adapted to Arctic conditions and experienced at hunting seals and seabirds along ice margins, could have followed this ice edge westward. They would have used skin boats similar to later Inuit kayaks and umiaks. They would have hunted seals and fish for food during the crossing. They would have camped on icebergs and ice floes during the journey. Eventually, after weeks or months of following the ice edge, they would have reached North America. It sounds insane. crossing the North Atlantic in skin boats during the Ice Age. But here's the thing. We know humans were capable of this kind of maritime adaptation by 20,000 years ago. We know they had waterproof clothing and sophisticated cold-weather survival skills. We know they were hunting in Arctic conditions along European coastlines. The technology existed. The skills existed. What we don't know is whether anyone was desperate or curious enough to keep going west when they reached the ice edge. Most archaeologists reject the Solitarian hypothesis, not because it's physically impossible, but because alternative explanations seem more likely. Maybe the tool technologies evolved independently. Maybe there were earlier connections we haven't found yet. Maybe the similarities are just coincidence, convergent evolution driven by similar needs. Without clear archaeological evidence of the crossing itself, the hypothesis remains speculation. Interesting, plausible, but unproven. Then we get to something we can actually prove. The Vikings. Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland is the only confirmed Norse settlement in North America, discovered in 1960, excavated over decades, absolutely proven through artifacts, architecture and radiocarbon dating to around 1000 CE. The Vikings made it to North America 500 years before Columbus. That's established fact. But here's what should keep you up at night. Lonso Meadows was probably not the first Viking settlement in the Americas. It was likely a stopping point, a repair station for ships travelling further south. The Norse sagas describe extensive exploration of what they called Vinland, the land of wine grapes. Grapes don't grow in Newfoundland, too cold. But they do grow along the coast of New England. The sagas describe multiple settlements, trading with indigenous populations, even armed conflicts. They describe commodities like timber and furs being shipped back to Greenland. Lonso Meadows seems too small and too temporary to be the only Norse presence in North America. So where are the other sites? Some archaeologists think we've already found them but can't prove they're Norse. There are dozens of enigmatic stone structures along the New England coast that could be Norse, could be colonial, could be indigenous. Without clear diagnostic artifacts, it's impossible to say. The Vikings were trading with indigenous populations. Most of what they would have left behind would be indistinguishable from native material after centuries of exposure. And here's the real question. If the Vikings were reaching North America by 1000 CE, who else might have made the crossing earlier? The Vikings were exceptional sailors, but they weren't superhuman. They were using technology and techniques that other maritime cultures could have developed independently. The Irish had ocean-going vessels centuries before the Vikings. St. Brendan's voyage, described in medieval texts, might be legendary, but it describes crossing the Atlantic in a skin-covered boat to a land of plenty. The descriptions match North America better than any location in Europe. Then there are the West African expeditions. The Manda Empire, centered in what's now Mali, was one of the richest and most sophisticated civilizations in medieval Africa. In 1311, Emperor Abubakari II allegedly assembled a fleet of 2,000 boats and sailed west into the Atlantic, searching for the edge of the ocean. He never returned. His successor, Mansa Musa, later told scholars in Cairo that his predecessor had believed the Atlantic had another shore and was determined to reach it. The Mande had ocean-going vessels. They were experienced navigators. They had the resources to mount large-scale maritime expeditions, and they would have been carried directly towards South America by the North Equatorial Current and the trade winds. It's the same route Columbus would take 200 years later. Did Abubakari II reach the Americas? We have no proof, but the Atlantic currents and winds would have carried his fleet directly there whether he intended it or not. Accidental crossings are entirely plausible, and that's the fundamental difference between the Atlantic and the Pacific. In the Pacific, humans deliberately crossed the ocean. They intended to reach new islands. They developed technologies specifically for long-distance voyaging. The evidence is clear and systematic. In the Atlantic, most pre-Columbian crossings were probably accidental. Fishing boats blown off course, trading vessels caught in storms, explorers who went too far and couldn't return. The Atlantic is harder to cross intentionally than the Pacific for several reasons. First, the prevailing winds in the North Atlantic blow from west to east. Getting to the Americas from Europe means sailing against the wind, which is possible but requires sophisticated sailing technology that might not have existed until medieval times. The exception is the far north, where winds are more variable, which is probably why the Vikings succeeded. Second, the Atlantic has no island chains to guide voyagers. In the Pacific, you can island hop most of the way across the ocean. In the Atlantic, it's Iceland, Greenland, then 2,000 miles of open ocean to North America. No stepping stones, no fallback positions. Third, the Atlantic's current patterns are less predictable than the Pacific's. In the Pacific, the trade winds and equatorial currents create reliable routes. In the Atlantic, the Gulf Stream, the Canary Current, and various gyres create complex patterns that can carry vessels in unexpected directions. But here's the thing about these current patterns. They make accidental crossings almost inevitable over long enough time periods. A fishing boat from West Africa gets caught in a storm and blown west. The North Equatorial Current carries it toward the Caribbean. Weeks later, starving but alive, the crew makes landfall in South America. Or a Phoenician trading vessel is blown off course in the Mediterranean, ends up in the Atlantic, gets caught in the Canary Current flowing south along the African coast, then gets picked up by the trade winds and currents that lead directly to Brazil. These aren't intentional voyages of discovery. They're disasters that happen to end with people reaching land instead of dying at sea. But they would have happened. The laws of probability guarantee it. Over thousands of years, hundreds of vessels would have been blown off course, caught in storms, carried by unexpected currents. Most would have sunk or drifted until everyone aboard died of thirst. But some, maybe a few dozen over several millennia, would have made it across. The question is whether any of those accidental voyagers survived long enough to leave evidence we can find today. And that's where archaeology hits a wall, because what would accidental Atlantic crossers leave behind? A few starving sailors landing on a beach in Brazil 2,000 years ago? They probably died within weeks if they couldn't find food, or if the local population was hostile. Maybe they survived long enough to pass on some genetic material, some cultural knowledge, a few trade goods. But finding that evidence after 2,000 years is nearly impossible. It would look like noise, like statistical anomalies in genetic studies, or unexplained artifacts that could just as easily be explained by independent invention or later contamination. This is why mainstream archaeology remains deeply skeptical of pre-Columbian Atlantic contact. Not because it's impossible, but because the evidence required to prove it is exactly the kind of evidence that wouldn't survive. A few individuals making accidental crossings wouldn't leave behind monumental architecture or massive trade networks. They'd leave behind genetic traces that could be explained by post-Columbian contact, artifacts that could be later intrusions, and chemical signatures that could be contamination. The Atlantic mystery isn't like the Pacific expansion. It's not a story of human determination and ingenuity systematically conquering the ocean. It's a story of accidents, disasters, and possibilities we can never quite prove or disprove. It's the frustrating recognition that the ocean was probably crossed dozens of times before Columbus, but in ways that left no clear evidence. And maybe that's appropriate, because the Atlantic crossings that changed history, the ones that led to permanent contact and cultural exchange, were the deliberate ones. The Vikings establishing temporary settlements, Columbus opening permanent routes. These were the crossings that mattered, not because they were first, but because they were systematic. They created connections that persisted, trade networks that changed both shores of the ocean, mixing of populations that reshaped human history. The earlier crossings, if they happened, were evolutionary dead ends. Fascinating mysteries, but ultimately footnotes. The real story of Atlantic crossing begins when humans developed the technology and social organization to cross deliberately and repeatedly, when they could go back and forth, when they could maintain connections across 3,000 miles of ocean. That's when the Atlantic stopped being a barrier and became a bridge. Everything before that was just practice. But before any human ever crossed an ocean, something had to change in the human brain itself. Because here's what nobody talks about when they discuss ancient seafaring. The technology, the boats, the navigation techniques, those are impressive, sure. But the real miracle wasn't the tools. It was the mind that could conceive of using them to reach a place that couldn't be seen, couldn't be known, might not even exist. Think about what it takes to plan an ocean crossing, not just physically, but mentally. You're standing on a beach looking at an endless horizon. Everything in your evolutionary history tells you that water means danger, drowning, storms, things that hunt in the deep. Every survival instinct screaming at you to stay on solid ground where you understand the rules, where you know what's edible, what's dangerous, how to find shelter. And yet, somehow, you have to override all of that. You have to imagine that beyond that horizon, beyond days or weeks of terrifying open water, there might be land, good land worth risking everything to reach. You can't see it. You can't know for certain it exists. You just have to believe. And then you have to convince other people to believe too. Because you can't cross an ocean alone. This requires a kind of abstract thinking that's almost unique in the animal kingdom. You need to hold multiple complex ideas in your head simultaneously. The concept of a distant place that exists but can't be perceived. The notion that temporary danger might lead to long-term safety. The understanding that knowledge from previous generations, stories about lands glimpsed from high points or inferred from bird flight patterns, might be reliable enough to bet your life on. Neuroscientists call this capacity for abstract reasoning and future planning the executive function of the prefrontal cortex. But that's just fancy language for something profound. It's the ability to imagine things that don't exist yet and then make them real through coordinated action. It's what separates humans from almost every other species on the planet. The archaeological record shows this cognitive revolution didn't happen all at once. Around 100,000 years ago, human brains had reached their modern size. But size isn't everything. What mattered was the wiring, the connections between different brain regions that allow a complex symbolic thought. The first clear evidence of this new kind of thinking appears around 70,000 years ago. Suddenly, archaeological sites start showing up with things that serve no practical survival purpose. Beads made from shells, transported hundreds of miles from the coast. Ochre, a red pigment, ground into powder and used for body decoration or cave painting. Abstract geometric patterns carved into bone and stone. This wasn't just art for art's sake. These objects represent something revolutionary. They're symbols, things that stand for other things. A bead isn't just a bead, it's a marker of status, a gift that represents alliance, a mnemonic device that helps remember a story. This capacity for symbolic thinking is the foundation of everything that makes us human. Language, culture, technology, religion, all of it requires the ability to let one thing represent another thing, and it's absolutely essential for ocean crossing, because you can't teach someone to navigate by showing them every wave and current pattern. You need symbols, stars that represent directions, stories that encode navigation knowledge, rituals that help people remember complex procedures across generations. The ancient Polynesians, who would later become history's greatest ocean voyagers, developed navigation systems so sophisticated they could reach tiny islands thousands of miles apart with remarkable accuracy. But these systems weren't written down. They were encoded in chants, in hand gestures, in the way master navigators felt the swell patterns through the hull of a canoe. This is transmitted knowledge, information that exists not in any single brain but in the collective memory of a culture, passed down through generations, refined and improved by countless navigators, each adding their observations to a body of wisdom that became more valuable than any physical tool. But transmitted knowledge requires something else. Language. Not just simple communication like other animals have, but complex grammatical language that can convey abstract concepts, hypothetical situations, precise technical instructions. Think about what you'd need to explain to someone planning their first ocean crossing. You'd need words for things they've never experienced. Open ocean swells that feel different from coastal waves, star positions that change with seasons, wind patterns that shift at different distances from land, weather signs that predict storms days in advance. You'd need conditional statements, if-then reasoning. If the wind shifts to the east and the clouds form these patterns, then you need to change course within 6 hours, or you'll miss the island entirely. You'd need to convey timescales, not just later today, but after 3 nights of sailing, or when the star reaches this position. You'd need to teach sequences of actions that make no sense individually, but are critical when combined. This kind of complex instruction requires language far more sophisticated than anything other species possess. Linguists believe fully modern human language emerged sometime between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago. Not coincidentally, this is exactly when humans began expanding out of Africa and into new environments that required innovative thinking and complex cooperation. The people who first crossed to Australia 65,000 years ago would have had language. They could plan, teach, coordinate in ways their ancestors couldn't. They could say, 3 days sailing toward the setting sun, we will reach an island where fresh water flows from rocks near the beach, and other people could understand and prepare accordingly. But language and abstract thinking alone don't explain why humans would attempt ocean crossings. Because here's the thing, staying put is almost always safer than leaving. Even if resources are scarce, even if population density is increasing, the known dangers of your current location are usually preferable to the unknown dangers of somewhere else. Every other primate species follows this logic. They'll expand their territory gradually if necessary, but they don't strike out into fundamentally foreign environments without being forced. So what forced humans, or more accurately, what motivated them? The traditional explanation is population pressure. Groups grow too large for their environment, resources become scarce, competition increases, and some people are pushed out to seek new territories. This certainly happened. The archaeological record shows periods of expansion that correlate with population growth. But population pressure alone doesn't explain ocean crossing, because when you're pressed for resources, you don't build boats and sail into the unknown. You fight your neighbours for their territory, or you move slowly into adjacent lands where you can see what you're getting into. No, ocean crossing required something else. A pull, not just a push. And this is where human psychology gets really interesting, because humans alone among all species seem to possess what you might call an exploratory drive that goes beyond practical necessity. We're curious in a way that's almost pathological. We see the horizon and we want to know what's beyond it. We hear stories of distant lands and we want to see them for ourselves. We encounter the unknown, and instead of feeling only fear, we feel fascination. This trait shows up again and again throughout human history. The Polynesians settling every inhabitable island in the Pacific, even tiny atolls that required weeks of sailing to reach. The Norse crossing the North Atlantic to Iceland, Greenland, and eventually North America. The Chinese treasure fleets of the 15th century exploring the Indian Ocean for reasons that had more to do with prestige and curiosity than practical benefit. Modern humans climbing mountains because they're there and exploring Antarctica despite its complete lack of resources. Other animals don't do this. They explore to the extent necessary for survival, and then they stop. Humans keep going. We explore for the sake of exploring. We take absurd risks to see what's over the next hill, across the next ocean, beyond the atmosphere of our planet. This exploratory drive is so fundamental to human nature that it has to have deep evolutionary roots, and those roots probably trace back to the post-bottleneck period when environmental unpredictability was the norm. Remember, our ancestors spent hundreds of thousands of years living in a world where conditions could change radically within a single lifetime. Groups that stayed in one place and specialized too narrowly went extinct when the climate shifted. Groups that remained curious, that explored new territories, that were willing to try new food sources and experiment with new survival strategies, those groups survived. Over enough generations, natural selection would favor individuals with a strong exploratory drive. People who felt compelled to see what was over the horizon, who experienced satisfaction from discovering new places, who could tolerate the anxiety of venturing into unknown territory. By the time modern humans were ready to cross oceans, this trait was hardwired into our psychology. We weren't just capable of imagining distant lands, we were driven to seek them, but this individual curiosity had to be channeled through collective action. Because you can't cross an ocean alone, you need boats, which means you need multiple people with specialized skills, someone who understands wood selection and hull design, someone who can weave sails or make rope, someone with navigation knowledge, someone who can organize provisions and plan for contingencies. This is where transmitted knowledge becomes critical. Ocean crossing isn't something you can figure out on your own through trial and error. You die on the first error. You need accumulated wisdom from previous generations, stories about successful crossings and failed ones, technical knowledge about boat building and navigation, practical experience with coastal sailing that gradually extends further from shore. The evolution from coastal hopping to open ocean voyaging probably took thousands of years. Early humans would have started by following coastlines, never losing sight of land. Archaeological sites from Southeast Asia show this pattern. Coastal settlements that gradually spread along shorelines, with people learning to exploit marine resources and developing boats for fishing and short-range transport. Then came the short hops. islands visible from the mainland, a few miles of open water, far enough to be challenging but close enough that you could see your destination. Success with these crossings would build confidence and refine techniques. Boats would improve, navigation skills would develop, the psychological barrier would begin to erode. Eventually someone would attempt a longer crossing. Maybe they'd seen birds flying from a distant point on the horizon and inferred there must be land in that direction. Maybe they'd been blown off course during a coastal voyage and stumbled on an island, then managed to find their way home with knowledge of a new territory. Maybe they'd climbed a high mountain and seen a smudge on the horizon that might have been land. However it happened, the first successful open ocean crossing would have been transformative, not just practically in terms of reaching new resources, but psychologically. It would prove that the seemingly impossible was possible, that humans could leave the known world and survive, that the stories and techniques passed down through generations actually worked. This success would inspire others. Knowledge about the crossing would spread through trade networks and kinship ties. The techniques would be refined and improved. The psychological barriers would continue to erode until open ocean voyaging became, if not routine, at least conceivable. But even then, you needed a certain kind of person to actually attempt it. Because no matter how good your boats and navigation techniques, ocean crossing remained incredibly dangerous. Storms could appear without warning. Navigational errors could leave you lost at sea. Food and water could run out if the crossing took longer than expected. The people who first crossed oceans were risk-takers by nature. Not reckless. The reckless ones died and their genes didn't continue. But calculated risk-takers. People who could assess dangers rationally, prepare thoroughly, and then commit fully to a course of action despite the possibility of catastrophic failure. Psychologists studying modern risk-taking behavior have identified certain personality traits that correlate with successful high-risk endeavors. Conscientiousness, the ability to plan and prepare carefully, openness to experience, the willingness to try new things and adapt to novel situations, stress tolerance, the capacity to remain calm and make good decisions under pressure. These traits are partially heritable. The ancient mariners who successfully crossed oceans and established new populations would have passed these psychological tendencies to their descendants. This means every human alive today, especially those descended from populations that crossed major oceans, carries genes that predispose toward calculated risk-taking and exploratory behavior. We are all descendants of the people who looked at an empty horizon and decided to see what was beyond it. The people who built boats and sailed into the unknown. The people who were curious enough, brave enough, or crazy enough to attempt the impossible. And here's the final piece of the puzzle, the spiritual and mythological dimensions. Because humans don't just think rationally. We create meaning. We tell stories. We develop beliefs about the world that go beyond simple cause and effect. Many ancient cultures had myths about lands beyond the horizon, paradise islands where ancestors dwelled, spirit realms that could only be reached by crossing water, promised lands where resources were abundant and life was easy. Were these myths just fantasies? Or were they encoding real knowledge about distant territories passed down through generations in story form? Maybe both. Maybe the myths about paradise islands were based on real accounts of successful crossings, transformed through retelling into spiritual narratives. Maybe the religious significance attributed to certain places, islands that were considered sacred or ancestral homelands, motivated voyages that pure practicality wouldn't justify. Maybe the courage required to attempt an ocean crossing could only be summoned by believing you weren't just seeking new hunting grounds, but fulfilling a divine mandate, following in the path of ancestors, or seeking communion with the spiritual realm. We'll never know exactly what motivated the first humans to cross open oceans, but we know they did it, and we know it required a unique combination of cognitive abilities, psychological traits, technical knowledge, and perhaps spiritual beliefs that came together in one species at one moment in evolutionary history. Humans alone looked at the horizon and imagined what lay beyond. Humans alone developed the language to transmit navigation knowledge across generations. Humans alone possessed the combination of curiosity and courage necessary to attempt the crossing, and humans alone succeeded in spreading across every inhabitable landmass on the planet, including islands that required weeks of open ocean voyaging to reach. We are the ocean crossers, the descendants of explorers who refused to be contained by geography, and that legacy, that ancient drive to see what's over the horizon, is still written in our genes, still pulling us toward the unknown. Here's something that should keep you awake at night. We know ancient humans crossed impossible stretches of ocean. We have the genetic evidence, the archaeological proof, the undeniable fact that people ended up on islands that required sophisticated seafaring to reach. But we have almost no idea how they actually did it. The techniques that allowed Stone Age humans to navigate thousands of miles of open ocean have vanished. Not just faded or been forgotten, but actively erased from history. And the reason why tells us something disturbing about how quickly human knowledge can disappear when cultures are disrupted or destroyed. Think about what happened when European colonizers encountered indigenous seafaring peoples across the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, along the coasts of Africa and the Americas. These were cultures that had maintained sophisticated maritime traditions for thousands, maybe tens of thousands of years. Navigation techniques passed down through hundreds of generations. Boat-building knowledge refined over millennia. Understanding of winds, currents, and star paths that allowed travel across trackless ocean. Then, within a few generations, sometimes within a few decades, it was gone. European diseases killed massive percentages of indigenous populations. The survivors were often forcibly converted, relocated, or enslaved. Traditional knowledge holders, the navigators and boat builders and oral historians who carried thousands of years of accumulated wisdom, they died before they could pass on what they knew. Or they were actively prevented from practicing their traditional ways by colonial authorities who considered native technologies primitive and worthless. By the time anthropologists got around to studying these cultures systematically, most of the knowledge was already lost. What we have are fragments, bits and pieces preserved by a handful of traditionalists who maintained the old ways despite everything. But huge portions of the picture are simply gone. Take Polynesian navigation, the stick charts of the Marshall Islands, the sophisticated understanding of ocean swells and star paths that allowed people to cross thousands of miles of open Pacific. We know it existed because a few master navigators in the 20th century still practiced it. But how much was lost before that? What techniques did they use that we'll never recover? Or consider the outrigger canoes that spread across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. We know these vessels were capable of extraordinary voyages, but the specific design principles that made them seaworthy in different conditions, the construction techniques that allowed them to flex in heavy seas without breaking apart, the material science that went into selecting and preparing woods and fibers and adhesives, most of that knowledge is gone. And that's just the stuff we know existed because some of it survived. What about the maritime traditions that vanished completely? the seafaring cultures that were wiped out before anyone bothered to document what they knew. The archaeological record is almost useless here because boats don't preserve, wood rots, plant fibers decay. Even in ideal conditions, organic materials rarely survive more than a few thousand years. We have stone tools from 2 million years ago, but we have virtually no watercraft older than about 10,000 years, and most of those are just fragments. This creates a massive blind spot in our understanding of ancient human capabilities. We can trace the evolution of stone tool technology in incredible detail because stone survives. We know exactly when humans started using fire because burnt earth and charcoal preserve well. But maritime technology, we're largely guessing based on indirect evidence, and here's the really frustrating part. Most of the coastlines where ancient humans would have developed seafaring traditions are now underwater. During the Ice Age, when sea levels were 400 feet lower than today, the world's coastlines looked completely different. Vast continental shelves that are now submerged were dry land. Indonesia and Malaysia and Australia were connected by a landscape called Sundaland. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. The English Channel didn't exist. These coastal plains were prime real estate for human populations, reliable food sources from both land and sea, moderate climates, easy transportation via coastal routes. Archaeological evidence from the few ancient coastal sites we can still access suggests these regions supported large, sophisticated human populations. Then the ice melted. Over about 10,000 years, starting around 20,000 years ago, sea levels rose dramatically. The coastlines where countless generations of humans had lived and developed maritime technologies were gradually flooded. Everything they built, every boat landing and fishing camp and coastal settlement, now sits under hundreds of feet of water and sediment. We've barely begun to explore these submerged landscapes. Underwater archaeology is expensive and technically challenging. The few sites that have been investigated have revealed tantalizing hints of sophisticated coastal cultures. Stone tools in places that could only have been reached when sea levels were much lower. Middens showing systematic exploitation of marine resources, evidence of structures and hearths and human activity along ancient shorelines. But these are just glimpses. The vast majority of the archaeological record from humanity's coastal past is simply inaccessible. We're trying to understand the history of seafaring while most of the evidence is buried beneath the ocean. Yet despite these challenges, despite the loss of traditional knowledge and the lack of physical evidence, we keep finding proof that ancient humans accomplished impossible maritime feats. The proof comes from genetics. DNA doesn't lie. It carries a precise record of human population movements, interbreeding events, migrations across vast distances. And increasingly, genetic analysis is revealing ocean crossings that nobody expected, journeys that shouldn't have been possible with the technology we thought ancient peoples possessed. Take the settlement of the Americas. For decades, the standard story was that humans first entered the Americas by walking across a land bridge from Siberia to Alaska about 15,000 years ago. Simple enough. But genetic evidence is now showing that the story is far more complex. Some Native American populations carry genetic markers suggesting multiple entry points into the Americas, not just the northern route through Alaska, but possibly Pacific coastal routes requiring sophisticated maritime travel. Some researchers think ancient peoples may have hugged the Pacific coast, using boats to bypass the ice sheets that covered the inland routes. Even more surprising, there's genetic evidence suggesting trans-Pacific contact between Polynesians and South American populations that occurred long before European contact. Sweet potato DNA tells the story. Sweet potatoes are native to South America, but they were being cultivated across Polynesia when Europeans first arrived. Somebody had to carry them across thousands of miles of open ocean. For years, this was dismissed as Europeans bringing sweet potatoes to Polynesia after they had obtained them from South America. But genetic analysis of the sweet potato varieties suggests the transfer happened much earlier, possibly around 1200 CE, carried by Polynesian navigators who reached South American shores and returned home. The genetic evidence gets even wilder when you look at the settlement of Madagascar. This massive island off the east coast of Africa was settled by people from Southeast Asia, specifically from Borneo and nearby regions, over 4,000 miles away across the Indian Ocean. Let that sink in. Sometime between 300 and 500 CE, Austronesian seafarers from Southeast Asia crossed the entire Indian Ocean and colonized Madagascar. Not a short island-hopping journey, but a massive ocean crossing that would challenge modern sailing vessels. They brought their language, which is still spoken in Madagascar today, and is clearly related to languages from Borneo. They brought their crops, including rice and bananas, that are Asian in origin. They brought their outrigger canoe technology, and they established a permanent settlement that thrived. How did they do it? We don't really know. The prevailing theory is that they didn't make the journey in one shot, but rather spread gradually along trade routes that connected Southeast Asia to India, to the Arabian Peninsula to East Africa. From there, some groups made the relatively shorter crossing to Madagascar, but even that explanation requires extraordinary maritime capabilities. We're talking about maintaining trade networks across thousands of miles of open ocean using pre-modern technology, navigating without compasses or maps, building boats capable of carrying not just people but livestock, plants and supplies for long voyages. And the Madagascar settlement wasn't a one-time fluke. The genetic evidence shows multiple waves of migration, suggesting sustained contact between Madagascar and Southeast Asia over several centuries. This wasn't accidental. This was systematic, purposeful, sophisticated seafaring, on a scale that supposedly shouldn't have been possible. Indigenous oral histories provide another source of evidence for ancient ocean crossings, though historians have often dismissed these stories as mythology, rather than taking them seriously as historical records. Pacific Islander traditions describe voyages across vast stretches of ocean, navigators who could read the waves and stars, discovery of distant islands that line up with actual geography. Hawaiian traditions describe the navigator Hawaii Lua discovering the Hawaiian Islands after following the stars and the flight paths of birds. Maori traditions in New Zealand describe the fleet of canoes that brought their ancestors from legendary Hawaii. For generations, Western scholars treated these stories as primitive legends, interesting folklore but not reliable history. But increasingly, genetic and archaeological evidence is confirming that these oral traditions contain genuine historical information, passed down through hundreds of generations with remarkable accuracy. The problem is, by the time researchers started taking indigenous knowledge seriously, much of the detail had already been lost. The navigation techniques described in the oral histories, the specific methods for building ocean-going canoes, the astronomical knowledge that allowed open ocean navigation, most of this was never properly documented before the knowledge holders died. Modern scientific techniques are starting to fill in some of the gaps, but it's slow work. Experimental archaeology has helped. Researchers have built replica ancient boats using traditional methods and materials, then actually sail them on long ocean voyages to test whether they could have made the journeys attributed to them. The Kon-Tiki expedition in 1947 where Thor Heyerdahl sailed a balsa raft from Peru to Polynesia, proved that such voyages were physically possible, even if his theories about South American settlement of Polynesia turned out to be wrong. More recent projects have built replicas of Polynesian voyaging canoes and successfully sailed them thousands of miles using only traditional navigation methods. These experiments show that ancient maritime technology was far more capable than most people assumed. A well-built outrigger canoe could carry dozens of people, plus supplies, across thousands of miles of open ocean. Traditional navigation techniques using stars, waves, clouds, and bird behavior could pinpoint islands with remarkable accuracy. But experimental archaeology can only take us so far. We're trying to recreate techniques based on fragmentary evidence. The master boat builders who knew all the secrets are gone. We can approximate their methods, but we're probably missing crucial details that made the difference between a good boat and a great one, between a skilled navigator and a master who never got lost. Computer modeling is providing new insights. Researchers can now simulate ancient ocean currents, seasonal wind patterns, and probable voyaging routes. They can test hypotheses about how ancient seafarers might have reached specific islands or crossed particular stretches of ocean. This work is revealing that some supposedly impossible journeys were actually quite feasible if you understand the seasonal wind and current patterns. The Indian Ocean, for instance, has a monsoon cycle that reverses wind direction seasonally. If you time your departure correctly, you can sail from East Africa to India on one monsoon, then return on the opposite monsoon months later. Ancient seafarers would have understood these patterns intimately. They didn't need compasses or GPS. They needed deep knowledge of the ocean environment, accumulated over generations of observation and experimentation, and they had it. Genetic analysis continues to reveal surprises. New techniques for analyzing ancient DNA are finding evidence of human population movements and interbreeding events that leave no trace in the archaeological record. We're discovering that humans were far more mobile than we thought, crossing oceans and establishing trade networks that spanned continents. But for every question genetics answers, it raises three more. The data shows people got from point A to point B, but it can't tell us how. It can't explain what kind of boats they used, or what navigation methods they employed, or how they organized these expeditions. The most frustrating thing is knowing that all this knowledge once existed. Thousands of years of accumulated maritime wisdom, refined techniques, navigational secrets that allowed people to cross oceans as casually as we drive to the grocery store. All of it was real. All of it was passed down through countless generations, and almost all of it is now lost. What future discoveries might reveal is anybody's guess. As underwater archaeology becomes more sophisticated, we might find preserved boats or harbour structures on submerged coastlines. Climate change, ironically, might expose ancient sites as glaciers melt and landscapes shift. New analytical techniques might extract information from sites that were previously uninformative. But we'll never recover most of what was lost. The master navigators who could guide boats across thousands of miles of open ocean using nothing but stars and wave patterns, their knowledge died with them. The boat builders who understood exactly which woods to use and how to shape them, and how to lash them together to create vessels that could survive anything the ocean threw at them, their techniques are gone. We're left with fragments and mysteries, proof that ancient humans accomplished extraordinary maritime feats, but almost no understanding of how they actually did it. It's like finding footprints leading across an impossible chasm with no bridge in sight. The footprints are real. People definitely crossed. but the techniques that made the crossing possible have vanished into history, leaving us to wonder how humans who supposedly lacked advanced technology managed to conquer the world's oceans thousands of years before we thought it was possible. So here's what we're left with. Somewhere between 65,000 and 50,000 years ago, groups of humans who had never seen an ocean horizon decided to cross it anyway. They built vessels from materials that should never have worked. They navigated using methods we're still trying to understand. They survived journeys that killed most who attempted them, and they did it not once, but repeatedly, across every ocean on Earth. These weren't accidents. They weren't lucky drifters blown off course by storms. The archaeological evidence is too consistent, too widespread, too deliberate. These were intentional crossings, planned expeditions into the unknown by people who had figured out something that should have been impossible with Stone Age technology. Think about what that required. Not just physically, the boat building, the navigation, the endurance to survive weeks at sea with limited food and water, but mentally, you had to believe the journey was possible when you had no proof. You had to convince others to join you when the ocean had probably already claimed friends and family members. You had to maintain hope and direction when everything you'd ever known disappeared behind you and nothing but water stretched ahead. That's not just survival. That's something else entirely. That's the same cognitive capability that would eventually build cities, develop writing, create mathematics, send spacecraft to other planets. The ability to imagine something that doesn't exist yet and work systematically to make it real. The ocean crossers were using that ability 50,000 years before the first civilization. They were solving engineering problems that would have challenged modern engineers. They were organizing expeditions that required cooperation, planning, and resource management at levels we usually associate with much later human societies. And every successful crossing changed us, not just culturally, though those changes were profound. The Polynesians who settled every habitable island in the Pacific, the first Australians who developed 40,000 years of continuous culture in isolation, the mysterious Atlantic crossers whose genetic signatures show up in unexpected places. Each journey created new populations, new adaptations, new branches of the human family tree. But it changed us genetically too. Those island populations faced new selection pressures, different foods, different diseases, different climates. They adapted, developing genetic variants that helped them thrive in their new homes. When later migrations brought them back into contact with mainland populations, those adaptations spread, enriching the human gene pool with innovations that have been tested in the harshest laboratory imaginable. Complete isolation on remote islands with limited resources. Today, every human on Earth carries genetic echoes of those ancient crossings, Pacific Islander ancestry in South American populations, Aboriginal Australian genetic markers that reveal Ice Age refuges, Denisovan DNA in island populations that could only have gotten there through sophisticated seafaring. We are all, in a very real sense, descendants of ocean crossers, people who looked at an impossible barrier and decided to cross it anyway. And here's what really gets me about this story. We forgot. For thousands of years, we convinced ourselves that pre-Columbian humans were primitive, incapable of sophisticated navigation, unable to undertake the kinds of journeys that we now know they accomplished routinely. We built this narrative where human achievement was linear, starting crude and simple, becoming complex only recently, where the pyramids needed aliens, where Pacific colonization required blind luck, where Atlantic crossings before Columbus were impossible. But the evidence keeps forcing us to revise that story. Every new archaeological site, every genetic study, every experimental voyage shows us that our ancestors were far more capable than we gave them credit for. They weren't primitive, they were us. Same intelligence, same problem-solving ability, same courage and creativity, just different tools and different challenges. That should humble us, but it should also inspire us. Because if people with stone tools and bark canoes could cross oceans, what can we do? If isolated populations with no written language could navigate thousands of miles of open water using only natural signs, what problems can we solve? The ocean crossers prove that humans have always been capable of achieving the impossible. We just have to believe it's possible and be willing to sail into the unknown to make it real. So the next time you face something that seems impossible, remember them. The first person who pushed a log raft into the current and trusted it would carry them somewhere new. The navigator who memorized star paths across half the Pacific. The family who loaded their children into a canoe and paddled toward a horizon they'd never see return from. They made us who we are. All of us, everywhere, descendants of people who dared the impossible journey. If you found this story as mind-blowing as I did, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. I'm genuinely curious how far this story travels. And subscribe, because there are so many more impossible journeys to explore. So many more stories about humans achieving things we're still trying to understand. Thanks for staying with me through this journey. Sleep well. And remember, you come from ocean crossers, people who made the impossible real.